Okay, everyone. Good morning. I know people are still coming in, but we've still got another day of conference, so I'm going to try my best to stick to time, and we're going to start right now. So, my name's Sarah Welch. I'm an addiction psychiatrist by background, and I've been working with the Lisbon team for a few years now, together with the co-producer, the Society for Study of Addiction, which is one of the several co-producers that you now know about. It's Friday, it's 9 o'clock, and it's the last day of the conference, and I think many of us are feeling that our heads are absolutely buzzing with new information. And for that reason, I think I'm so happy, really, to be chairing this session right now, because I think this one is a chance to take a step back, to breathe, and to examine the ways that we think about some of the key areas in our field. We've got two speakers. They're going to address two very different topics. Some of you will feel familiar with one of them, some of them with the other, and maybe some of you will feel familiar with both. But what they have in common is that both speakers are bringing science to inform and maybe to challenge the frameworks we use to think about the topics they're addressing. So we've had a bit of communication with each other, actually, before the session, and each of them has already managed to gently disrupt the ways that I had been thinking about their specialist areas. And I'm hoping you have that experience too, because that's one of the ways in which conferences are refreshing. Just before I introduce our first speaker, I'm just going to explain how we're going to do it. Because the content of the two speakers' talks is very different, I am going to take questions immediately after each talk. And then towards the end, I think if we have enough time, we may answer some questions between us as a panel. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Professor Marc Potenza. Marc is the Stephen M. Southwick Professor of Psychiatry. He's a professor at the University of Yale School of Medicine, where he directs actually several research sections, but including the Yale Center of Excellence in Gambling Research. Marc's research focuses on the neurobiology and treatment of addictions and other disorders characterized by impaired impulse control and reward-related motivations. He's contributed to our understanding of the clinical presentation and the neurobiology of these disorders, the ways they co-occur with other mental health problems, and the development of treatment and prevention strategies. And his research has applied neuroimaging, genetic, epidemiological, and clinical trials methodologies. So Marc, without further delay, the floor is yours.
So thank you. Thank you for the organizing committee for inviting me to speak on this topic. And I was asked to speak on the topic of how our existing models of behavioral addictions fit our understanding of substance use disorders. So I have a listing of disclosures with respect to relationships with pharmaceutical, nonprofit, gambling, gaming, and legal entities. And I thought I would start the talk, like I do many talks, in thinking about the historical context of the term addiction. And the word is derived from a Latin word meaning bound to or enslaved by, and in its original formulation was not linked to patterns of substance use. However, back in the 1980s, the Substance Use Disorder Work Group for the DSM believed that substance use disorders and addiction could be defined as compulsive drug use. However, in the 1990s, people like Howard Schaefer proposed that there were core elements such as impaired control, continued use or engagement despite adverse consequences, as well as a craving or an urge state that immediately preceded the engagement in the behavior. And if you thought of these as core elements of addiction, then perhaps the term could be applied to a broader range of behaviors. And then Constance Holden, in two articles in the first decade of this millennia in the journal Science, I think bookended the decade with this idea of behavioral addictions and how it progressed during the course of the decade. So in the first article, she asked whether behavioral addictions existed and whether we could use new technologies like brain imaging to understand similarities between gambling and drug use behaviors. And then in 2010, she had the article Behavioral Addictions Debut and Proposed DSM-5, where she kindly presented some of our work to show how individuals without addictions were similarly different with respect to individuals with gambling disorder or cocaine use disorder. So how have the two main nomenclature systems that consider psychiatric disorders considered gambling disorder and other putative behavioral addictions? Going back to DSM-3 in 1980, gambling disorder was introduced under the name pathological gambling, which has since been changed to reduce stigma associated with the name and the disorder, as many people with gambling disorder do not enter into treatment. When it was introduced, it was classified as an impulse control disorder, not elsewhere classified. And this was a rather heterogeneous grouping of disorders. And at the time, it was debated in the 1990s whether gambling disorder might be considered an addiction without the drug or an obsessive-compulsive spectrum disorder, despite its classification as an impulse control disorder. And so going from DSM-4 to DSM-5, several DSM-5 research work groups considered these questions. And I was involved in two of these groups and collected the data, synthesized the information across multiple domains to look at similarities and differences between gambling disorder and substance use disorders, and gambling disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder. And the data seemed to fit most with gambling disorder having similarities with substance use disorders. And this was reflected in multiple domains. There were high rates of co-occurrences between gambling and substance use disorders. So for example, the National Comorbidity Replication Study in the United States found that close to 60% of individuals with gambling disorder had a tobacco use disorder, among other substance use disorders. There are similarities in the clinical courses with high rates in adolescents and young adults, lower rates in older adults, as well as a telescoping phenomenon that was initially described now about 60 years ago for individuals with alcohol use disorder, whereby individuals, females as compared to males, initiated in the behavior later in life, but the time frame between initiation and development of a problem was foreshortened or telescoped. And since that time, similar observations have been noted for drug use disorders, and then our group, Armando Tavares' group in Brazil, John Grant's group in Minnesota, all around the same time, noted this phenomena in individuals with gambling disorder. There are similarities in the clinical characteristics, some of which I've described and are reflected in the diagnostic criteria. And then I think importantly, there are similarities in the biologies at genetic levels, as well as brain-based levels. And this then may be reflected in the interventions that are helpful for people with gambling and substance use disorders, be it self-help groups like 12 Steps, Gamblers Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, and others, the behavioral therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, pharmacotherapies like opioid receptor antagonists, although these are not formally indicated for gambling disorder or other behavioral addictions, and then nutraceuticals like N-acetylcysteine. So what are some of the biological similarities that cut across gambling and substance use disorders? So the left three images are from a meta-analysis that Marcia Luchin and colleagues published, looking at data from monetary incentive delay task, fMRI studies. And essentially, during the anticipatory phase of reward processing, individuals with substance use disorders or gambling disorder show this blunted striatal activation. And this finding is consistent with reward deficiency models of addictions that Ken Blum and others have proposed. We have also seen this using a separate task in individuals with internet gaming disorder, suggesting that this might cut across a broader range of behavioral addictions. So in anticipation of DSM-5, there were several domains that were controversial. And these are clips from, or images from a Time magazine article the year before the DSM-5 was released, and they asked what counts as crazy and what are the new abnormal conditions. And each of these, whether it be eating or internet use or sex, could be conceptualized within addiction frameworks. And the use of the internet by the time the DSM-5 was being considered was undergoing rapid changes. So the substance use disorder work group considered the internet as a potential addiction domain. And the way in which the committee considered the internet was more as a delivery device akin to a syringe for individuals with intravenous drug use. And they focused on the content that people were consuming on the internet as the basis for a potential disorder. And at the time, there were reports of deaths in internet cafes in Asia where people were in extended gaming marathon periods and were not attending to their bodily needs. Reports of parents leaving their children unattended while gaming and the children passing. So the group felt that internet gaming disorder should be considered as a potential diagnosis, but there were insufficient data to include it as a clinical diagnosis, so it was included in the research section of DSM-5. And then the World Health Organization similarly wanted to consider internet use behaviors for ICD-11, and I'll get to that in a bit. We also were interested, prior to DSM-5 being released, we were interested in understanding gaming behaviors, internet use behaviors, and other potential behavioral addictions. And one of our studies where we looked at adolescents during a reward processing task using EEG found that those individuals with at-risk or problematic internet use showed a blunted reward responsiveness via EEG signals, again, resonating with some of the monetary incentive delay task data. Now, dual process models of addiction suggest that there is impaired control over motivational drive that leads to the engagement in addictive behaviors. So one study led by Guangheng Dang used resting state functional connectivity measures to examine functional connectivity within an executive control network and found that individuals with internet gaming disorder showed less cohesion within this executive control network. And the degree of cohesion was linked to out-of-the-magnet measures of cognitive control on the Stroop color word interference test, so suggesting poorer control in the individuals with internet gaming disorder, both at brain-based levels and at behavioral levels in a way that was linked. Now, there have been a number of studies of individuals with internet gaming disorder. Of some of the structural MRI studies, we conducted a meta-analysis and found that individuals with internet gaming disorder showed relatively reduced gray matter volumes within regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate gyrus. And the schematic from NIDA suggests that these brain regions are important for motivational drive and inhibitory control, again, linking to dual process models of addiction. Going back a decade, Guangheng Dang and I proposed a model for internet gaming disorder based on existing data for gambling and substance use disorders, targeting domains like executive control and reward processing and decision making, and suggesting that possible therapies could be helpful in targeting these domains as they have been in addictive disorders generally. So after the DSM-5 was released, there were questions regarding the degree to which the ICD-11 would harmonize with DSM-5 with respect to behavioral addictions related to gambling and gaming, as well as hypersexuality. And with hypersexual disorder, this was considered for inclusion in DSM-5. There was a field trial conducted. The sexual and gender identity disorder work group proposed it for inclusion, but it was omitted entirely from the DSM-5. So going back now about a decade, we began meeting on an annual basis to focus on internet use and addictive behaviors and the extent to which internet use behaviors might be considered as the focus of disorders. And when we were thinking about how to define gaming disorder as we were following, in some ways, considering the DSM-5 decisions, there was controversy in the field that can be reflected here in this scholarly debate about some groups of individuals, ourselves, believing that it would be important to include gaming disorder for clinical and public health purposes, and other groups feeling as if it was premature to include gaming disorder as a formal clinical diagnosis. This was also reflected in the lay media, where on back-to-back days, the Times had headlines of game addict disorder is a moral panic, and then the National Health Service is to open an addiction clinic for young online gamers. Similarly, with respect to compulsive sexual behavior disorder, there was debate in the pages of Lancet Psychiatry, as well as in World Psychiatry, considering the inclusion of compulsive sexual behavior disorder in the ICD-11. And when we reviewed the biological data, we made a statement that we believed that the existing data suggested that the classification of compulsive sexual behavior disorder may be best suited as a behavioral addiction rather than an impulse control disorder. So what happened when the World Health Assembly met in May of 2019? Gambling and gaming disorders were included as disorders due to addictive behaviors. Hazardous gambling and hazardous gaming were also included, and these are akin to hazardous or harmful alcohol use designations that are important for public health initiatives in particular. And then compulsive sexual behavior disorder was included as an impulse control disorder. And so while I personally was happy that compulsive sexual behavior disorder was included as a diagnosis, having it included as an impulse control disorder may have implications. Some of those implications may be with respect to who gets treatment, as this piece now 9 years ago, where I communicated that in some jurisdictions, governments require addiction treatment centers to provide care for people with behavioral addiction. So having a disorder classified as a behavioral addiction versus an impulse control disorder may have implications for training and treatment and other areas. So as we've heard about in many of the talks throughout the conference, the internet has changed the ways in which many people engage in many behaviors. So going back now 8 years ago, Matthias Brandt and colleagues generated an interaction of person, affect, cognition, and execution model, or the IPACE model, to focus on specific internet use disorders. And 3 years later, this was updated to generalize to addictive behaviors beyond internet use. And the model was more fully characterized with respect to developmental stages in the addiction process. So the initial IPACE model is shown here. It's a relatively complex model, but the core component is what I would like to focus on, where in the updated model, we looked at early stages, where this central part involved how people responded to external and internal stimuli that generated affective and cognitive responses that were under inhibitory control, leading to decisions to behave in certain manners that in the initial stages of engagement were largely driven by gratification, and then this led to how people would anticipate rewards with those behaviors in subsequent settings. Now, in later stages in the addiction process, similar external and internal stimuli may lead to more cue reactivity and craving that is under less inhibitory control and leads to more habitual engagement in the behavior that is more driven by compensation rather than gratification, leading to affective and cognitive biases and coping strategies. We also, in the updated IPACE, considered more fully the environmental context and individual differences with respect to how people reacted to those contexts, and then the consequences of those interactions, particularly with respect to habitual or compulsive engagement and continued engagement despite adverse consequences. And we also included some brain-based considerations with respect to the golden arrows and circles highlighting more early stage processes, the blue later stage processes where the behaviors became more habitual or compulsive in nature. So how well do these models fit the data or vice versa? So we've been trying to understand across diagnostic groups and across areas the extent to which, for example, we can use brain data to predict subjective craving. And so in this study led by Kathleen Katie Garrison, we used data from a guided imagery paradigm, which included stress-related conditions, neutral relaxing conditions, and then appetitive conditions linked to alcohol use, cocaine use, or food craving. And we found that across these conditions, across groups, we could look at the ways in which different canonical brain networks interacted to predict the subjective craving. And that's highlighted here in this grid. We then looked at several of these studies using different approaches, some videotaped approaches, some audio tape approaches, some picture cue reactivity approaches to look across cocaine use disorder, gambling disorder, gaming disorder, and other conditions to look at the ways in which these brain networks either integrated or were segregated with respect to predicting craving. And the take-home here is that there were 4 studies that were considered. The more colorful the circle is, the more reproducible the findings were. And so if we look at how these grouped, there were automatic reactive mechanisms that involved interactions between subcortical, basal ganglia brain regions, and motor sensory brain regions, and how these interacted with visual processing and default mode networks seem to be the most highly reproducible for craving across diagnostic groups and across states. We've also used this similar connectome-based predictive modeling approach to look at transdiagnostic measures. So in this case, punishment sensitivity and behavioral inhibition was predicted in a group of college-age students, and we linked it to alcohol consumption and stressful or negative life events. And it's important to consider gender and sex in these studies, as we found that here the network that predicted punishment sensitivity and behavioral inhibition was linked inversely to alcohol use in men, but positively to negative life experiences in women. Then we also looked at cognitive control data here in a sample of close to 200 individuals, either with gambling disorder, cocaine use disorder, binge eating disorder, or none of those conditions. And what we found was that using an intrinsic connectivity distribution analysis that looks at the extent to which any voxel in the brain is related to other voxels in the brain, we found a main effective group that implicated the posterior cingulate cortex, which is a hub of sorts in the brain. And then when we used that identified region as a seed, we found that the affected individuals differed from the unaffected individuals with respect to connectivity between the posterior cingulate and bilateral insula. Now, in another set of studies led by Yihang Xiao, we used a different approach to look at structural covariation. And here we initially looked at adults, and we picked over 200 brain measures based on a mouse model of alcohol binge consumption. And we found that in adults, we found a brain structural covariation pattern that accounted for between 30 and 40% of the variance, and was linked in 2 independent samples to early initiation of alcohol use, so before the age of legal drinking. And then we used a similar approach and applied this to the ABCD data, which was discussed earlier in the conference. So this is a study of over 11,000 developing youth, and we looked at the wave 1 data in this case. So these are in 9 to 10-year-old children. We found that this brain structural covariation pattern was again identified, again accounted for between 30 to 40% of the variance, and the correlation was very strong. The correlation was 0.98 between the child and the adult samples. And in the case of the children in ABCD, this brain structural covariation pattern was linked to high-frequency screen media activity and externalizing behaviors. And furthermore, in a subsequent analysis, because ABCD is a longitudinal study, we found that changes in this brain structural covariation pattern over the course of a year mediated the relationship between high-frequency screen media activity in the 9 to 10-year-old children and internalizing concerns 2 years later in the children. So again, linking these behaviors together across substance and non-substance risk behaviors. Now, the ICD-11 did not include all potential behavioral addictions. So for example, shopping, buying behaviors and social media behaviors were not specified. But there is this designation of other specified disorders due to addictive behaviors that we propose could be used to classify problematic use of social media. We believe that this is important. For example, the US Surgeon General has released a guidance regarding youth mental health and social media use, and has more recently called for warning labels to be placed on social media platforms akin to how they're used for tobacco and alcohol use products. And we have been working on a Lancet Psychiatry Commission report. There's a brief commentary that was published over the last 2 weeks on this in Lancet Psychiatry. And this follows up on a COST initiative, a Cooperation in Science and Technology initiative that focused on problematic usage of the internet. And we generated an e-booklet for interested stakeholders that has a lot of practical information, including for parents. And then we have upcoming in the American Journal of Psychiatry a current advances in behavioral addictions article that's in press that focuses on gambling, gaming, social media use, shopping, buying behaviors, and problematic pornography use. So I'd like to conclude by saying that we believe that there are significant overlaps between behavioral addictions and substance use disorders, both with respect to the models that have been proposed and the data that support those models. There's been more work done in the area of substance use disorders, and there are important gaps that exist with respect to behavioral addictions. So, for example, there are no medications that have regulatory indications for behavioral addictions, and we need more research to understand a broader range of behaviors like social media use in addiction contexts. So I'd like to thank a large number of individuals, funding agencies, and thank you for your attention.
Marc, oh, is this working? Yes. Marc, thank you so much. That was an incredible wealth of information and explanation and enlightenment. I so enjoyed that. I'm so glad that you gave us a bit of a historical context, because I think that many people here, whether you work in clinical work or policy or public health, will relate to the kind of evolution in thinking that happens and the ways in which neurobiology, pharmacology, and the descriptions and explanations of people with lived experience actually challenge the ways that we think about things. And also, I'm really glad, I think you made it so clear that classification and models, they're not just academic exercises, they do actually influence how senior decision makers approach provision of services to help people. They really are very important. I'm hoping that people are going to move towards the microphones. We've got one here, two here at the front and two here at the back. It is really quite difficult to see, but if you have questions for Marc, if you could just make your way to a microphone. I can see some people moving here. We're going to struggle a little bit to see the microphones at the back, so yeah, that's okay. I can just about see them now.
Yes.
So microphone 2.
Yes. Thank you, Marc, for this great presentation. I had a question about, do you have insight on the rationale for WHO not to have put the hypersexual behavior into the addiction chapter?
Yeah, so the question was about the exclusion of hypersexual disorder from the DSM-5. And I was not involved in that work group, but Marty Kafka and others have written after the decision was made. They have several brief pieces on the exclusion, and I think they had advocated for it to be my understanding is they had advocated it for it to be a formal clinical diagnosis. The data from the hypersexual disorder field trial suggested that this is very clinically relevant, but then there was the decision that was made to exclude it. The ICD-11 had a different process, and I'm glad that there is now this definition of compulsive sexual behavior disorder in the ICD-11. We'll see if, as more data are collected, whether it stays classified as an impulse control disorder or perhaps gets reclassified the way that gambling disorder historically was initially classified as an impulse control disorder in both the DSM and the ICD. And then as data accumulated, it was moved into what I think is a more appropriate classification area. But having the diagnostic criteria well defined is very helpful for the field. It's very helpful for researchers, it's very helpful for clinicians, it's very helpful for policymakers. And the descriptors under compulsive sexual behavior disorder have been developing further over time since the initial release of the ICD-11, and now is more clear to include problematic pornography use within the domain of compulsive sexual behavior disorder, as there's been debate as to whether this should be best classified as another specified disorder due to addictive behaviors or as compulsive sexual behavior disorder. And from a clinical perspective, particularly among men with compulsive sexual behavior disorder, problematic pornography use is a very relevant concern for many men with compulsive sexual behaviors. For women, there tends to be more of a sexual partnered form of compulsive sexual behaviors that is more frequently problematic for women as compared with men.
Thank you, Marc. I think you have a question right up there at microphone 3.
Thank you, Marc Potenza, for a very nice lecture. Isn't some of the problem with this that we treat addiction as a binary phenomenon, and it's really a dimensional phenomenon? It's a bit arbitrary what falls within and without the diagnostic categories.
Yeah, so the question is, where do we draw the line between addictive behaviors, whether this is binary or whether this is more graded? And I, like I think you were suggesting, believe that this is more graded. I think this is more fully captured within the ICD-11 as compared to the DSM-5 with the hazardous categories of, for gambling and gaming. And I do think that if we look at the data, for example, from the NESARC study, the National Epidemiological Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, in Wave 1, they included assessments for gambling disorder. And so this sample of over 43,000 individuals in the United States, we found that across different groups of problem gambling severity, there were concerns, particularly with respect to co-occurring disorders, that one would see most robustly with individuals who met full criteria, but if you divided out problem at risk and low risk groups, you would see elevated odds for many psychiatric disorders across the spectrum. They may have had lower odds ratios, but the concerns were there with increasing severity of problem gambling. There was increasing concern. Not always seen in that fashion. So for example, in older adults and in some other populations, military veterans, we found that levels of recreational gambling are linked with lower odds of concerns as compared to a non-gambling group or an at-risk problem gambling group. So it's, I think it's important for us to consider the different gradations and look at this from different perspectives in different groups, including from the general population.
Thanks.
Thank you. And we've got a question at microphone 2. I think this probably will be the last question before we move on, but if you do have questions later on, I think we'll have a little time. So microphone 2.
Thanks, Marc. That was excellent. And that was a perfect lead-in because I was wondering about that Constance Holden question you posed at the beginning. Do behavioral addictions exist? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask, especially in light of that notion of a binary versus dimensional or graded thing, you know, a government like France in the example of treatment needs to make a decision that is fundamentally binary about what gets treated. Someone with lived experience has to make a decision, do I qualify for gambling addiction? Or another example I haven't seen that much in this conference is food addiction. Do I qualify for overeating or what have you? So if you do believe that the neurobiological data says that these are graded dimensional phenomena, how do you, on a diagnostic committee or otherwise, make a call about whether something exists or not? Or in other words, what does it mean for these conditions to exist?
Yeah, so the question is, if I understand correctly, correctly, again goes back to this gradation, and where do you draw the line between, to help different decision makers, for example, with respect to policy, how do we define something as concerning and devote resources towards it, and how do we best address it? And I think a lot of this holds for substance use behaviors as well. And alcohol, I think, is a good example of this, where there are different gradations of where you draw the line of an alcohol use disorder. And historically, that has changed. We've had in the DSM alcohol dependence and alcohol abuse, and when you looked at the data, those actually fit together under one construct with different severity levels, which was then reflected in the changes going from DSM-4 to DSM-5. ICD-11 took a different approach, but again has the different designations of alcohol use disorders and hazardous and harmful levels. So, and as we gather more data, the public health recommendations about what constitutes healthy levels of alcohol consumption, they change. And we do need to use the information and gather the data and use that information in a fashion that is not biased and is not subject to misinterpretation or misuse. It's complicated, but I think it's important for us to do so. And I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. Okay.
Thank you so much, Marc. So we're going to need you later. Stay there. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our second speaker. Dr. Robyn Burton is a senior research fellow at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and she specializes in alcohol and global health. She has extensive experience in public health research and policy, and she's advised senior decision makers in government settings and also in the World Health Organization. Today, Robyn's going to talk about understanding the relationships between substance use disorders and other health outcomes, with a particular focus on cancer. So Robyn, if you'd like to come to the podium.
Okay, so I'd like to start by thanking all of my wonderful co-authors, some of whom are in the room, for their contribution for the work that I'm going to present. Quite a different presentation from Marc, so we're kind of going upstream epidemiology in public health, so if we have any public health specialists in the room, hello and welcome. So alcohol consumption, smoking, and excess weight all independently increase the risk of morbidity and mortality, and for some of the outcomes are the same. So we know that heavy drinking increases the risk of liver disease, and excess weight also increases the risk of liver disease. Now, most epidemiological research looks at the independent association between a risk and an outcome. So, for example, it might look at alcohol but not smoking, or smoking but not alcohol, but in reality, many of these risks co-occur. So in England, there are around 11.2 million adults who have 2 or more risks. And for that reason, it's really important to think about and explore joint risk relationships. So I'm going to talk a bit about statistical interaction. So for those of you that are not statistically minded in the room, here's a very brief overview. So 2 risks may act independently or they may interact. And interact is simply the extent to which joint association differs from the independent associations. So the type of interaction I'm going to be talking about today is synergistic interaction. And this is when the risk from 2 exposures results in a greater risk than the sum of each exposure on its own. So simply, let's say if we're looking at cancer, if we have an odds ratio for smoking without alcohol of 2, or we have an odds ratio of alcohol without smoking of 2, if the risk from both smoking and alcohol is greater than 4, in other words, 2 plus 2, we can infer that there is synergistic interaction. Now, synergistic interaction is really important from a public health perspective because it implies that the number of cases of disease attributable to the combined effect of two risks is greater than the sum of the number of cases of disease that would be caused by each risk on its own. So I'm going to talk about a paper that was published earlier this year in Public Health. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis of published observational studies, and it aimed to quantify the independent and joint associations of alcohol, smoking, and excess weight across a range of health outcomes, and importantly, to identify whether these health associations are synergistic. So we included a very wide range of outcomes. We have both morbidity and mortality, and we permitted anything with an ICD-10 code or an established clinical marker of disease, so for example, liver serum tests. Now, in our paper, we have all sorts. We have degenerative disease, we have autoimmune disease, cancers, cardiovascular disease. Please do go and take a look. But today I'm only going to be talking about head and neck cancers, and although the title of my presentation said cancer, I've actually snuck in liver disease, so any hepatologists among us will be very pleased. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but the trial was, it's not a trial, it's a review, was pre-registered. We're looking only at the adult population, and atypical populations were excluded, so whether that was prisoners or pregnant women. As I've said, the outcomes were very varied, and then the exposures of interest were alcohol consumption, smokable tobacco, and excess weight. So e-cigarettes and non-smokable tobacco were not included in this piece of work. So again, this is a bit of a boring figure, but I wanted to just draw attention to the fact that I made my poor team screen 26,000 papers, so this really was huge. And we've ended up with about 100 papers in the final review. If I use my mouse, can you see it? No, okay. For some of the outcomes, we had enough estimates to meta-analyze. Where we didn't, we still calculated interaction on the measures of association, but then these were narratively synthesized. So, when we did the meta-analysis, there were two ways we could have done it. We could have done a meta-analysis on the alcohol estimate, on the tobacco estimate, on the alcohol and tobacco estimate, and then calculated interaction using those global estimates. But actually, a much more valid way to do it is calculate interaction at the study level and then do a meta-analysis on that measure of interaction. So, statistics people, that's quite a novel method. It's pretty cool. Very happy to talk to you all about it in more detail. But the measure we then used to meta-analyze, so the measure of interaction, is what's called the synergy index. Now, the synergy index is the excess risk from exposure to both exposures, e.g. smoking and alcohol, when there is interaction relative to the excess risk from exposure to both exposures without interaction. So for each study, we extracted the independent and the joint associations, and we calculated the synergy index, and this was used as our measurement in the meta-analysis. And then to obtain confidence intervals for the synergy index, we used Monte Carlo simulation techniques using the measure of association and confidence intervals to establish an error distribution. We ran 20,000 simulations for each estimate where they converged and then selected the appropriate percentiles. So I'm going to dive straight in with the results, and these are the results for head and neck cancer. So what we have here is we have the odds ratio, we have the baseline risk, we have the risk just for alcohol, we have the risk just for smoking, and then the interaction is the risk for both alcohol and smoking. So you can immediately see that the joint risk from both smoking and drinking is considerably more than the sum of those independent risks. So this then is a meta-analysis, nice big screen, so hopefully you can see it. This includes 138,000 individuals, and all the hard work of screening and Monte Carlo simulation ultimately ends in this little number at the bottom here, which tells us that the combined effect of smoking and alcohol on head and neck cancers was 3.8 times greater than the additive effect of each exposure. So there's clearly a synergistic relationship between alcohol and tobacco. We've done some subgroup analysis, so by low, moderate, and high risk of bias, but actually that didn't change our estimate very much. What you will see is there are some green dots, there are some orange dots, and there are some red dots. So green dots are studies that use disease as an endpoint. That could be prevalence, incidence, hospitalization. Red is studies that use death as an endpoint. And then orange are studies that used both disease and death, and we were not able to disaggregate those outcomes. So what I should say as well is I'm displaying the data for all head and neck cancers, so this would be esophageal cancer, larynx cancer, pharynx cancer, but actually when we do subgroup analysis by the type of cancer, the synergistic relationship still applies. Sarah, am I shouting or am I... Sorry, because I've got an ear infection, so I'm kind of deaf in one ear. I'm not shouting, am I?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
I also can't see anyone, so I can't see if you're all sort of... but please do interrupt if I am shouting. So moving on to liver disease now for the hepatologists. This is the same effect. So we have relative risk, except odds ratios. And again, we have the baseline risk, we have our excess weight risk, we have our alcohol risk, and we have our combined risk. Come on in, guys. It doesn't matter. Interrupt. And again, what we can see is that the combined risk is considerably more than the sum of the parts. And same thing again, except this time now, there are 2.6 million adults feeding into this analysis, and it all boils down to this little value at the bottom that tells us that the combined effect of alcohol and excess weight on liver disease was 1.6 times greater than the additive effect of each exposure on its own. So the tobacco and alcohol finding with head and neck cancers is a bit better known, but actually the number of hepatologists I speak to and work with that don't necessarily know that this is a synergy that occurs is quite telling and something I think we need to think more about. So you'll see that the endpoints, so the red, orange, and green, are quite a bit more mixed in terms of what they looked at. And then again, for liver disease here, this is all types of liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, alcoholic cirrhosis. But actually, when you do subgroup analysis on the different types of liver disease, they both have this synergistic relationship. Now, I also want to draw attention to the fact that even when joint risk relationships were not synergistic, they could still be very, very large, and this is still really important. So, for example, alcohol and smoking would increase the risk of colorectal cancer up to 10.7 times and periodontitis up to 9.8 times. Smoking and weight increased the risk of pancreatic cancer up to 4.7 times and ischemic stroke up to 3.6 times. And I've popped in a smoking-alcohol combination there just for completeness, which would increase the risk of all-cause death up to 3.5 times. So even if joint relationships were not synergistic, they could be very, very large. So what do these findings mean? So these clustered risks have clear clinical consequences, and it means that we are underestimating the population at risk. So I'm from England, but I work in a Scottish university. These are English figures. But currently in England, there are 6.9 million adults who drink at risk and also have excess weight. Now, this is really important because when we think about our alcohol risk population, we sort of look at the drinking in the population, and then when we look at our excess weight population, we look at them, and we're not actually looking at them together and saying, wait a minute, these things overlap. So there's a greater number of people at risk than we are currently thinking about, or some of us are currently thinking about. Hopefully, all of us will not be doing that after my talk. And we similarly have 2.9 million adults who are both drinking at risk levels and smoke, and they are therefore experiencing this synergistic risk for head and neck cancers. What does this mean for interventions, though? So this is not just interesting, this is meaningful from public health. So this means that people who drink and smoke would experience a greater absolute risk reduction from an alcohol intervention compared to people who only drink and vice versa. So if we have two drinkers drinking 50 units per week, but one of them smokes, and we do some intervention that lowers them to 30 units per week, the risk reduction in our smoker is going to be more than the risk reduction in just our drinker, despite the fact that their change in alcohol consumption and starting and ending levels are the same. So we need to start thinking about it. And it's also really important because certain risks are more likely to co-occur, and we know it won't be a surprise to anybody in the room that multiple risks are more prevalent in the most deprived. So, why aren't we thinking about these risks together? So this is a piece of work we published last year. It's very straightforward. It's just a cross-section analysis of a representative population health survey, but I think it demonstrates the point really nicely. So in the column on the left, we have our first risk, so that first row, increasing and higher risk drinking. That's more than 14 UK units of alcohol per week. And then overweight and obese, according to BMI, that leaves us with 6.9 million adults in England who have both of those risks. Now, you'll see here that I've also got some figures for at-risk gambling, which is operationalized using the PGSI. I fully accept that there isn't a dose-response relationship between gambling and liver cirrhosis, but I left these figures in because I thought it would be of interest to people in the room. So prevalence is one thing, but actually we need to look at how closely risks cluster. So what we have here is a range of prevalence odds ratios. So a prevalence odds ratio can be interpreted as follows. So it's really annoying that you can't see my mouse because I keep pointing to things. So increasing and high risk drinkers are 2.68 times more likely to also be a smoker, and they are 2.66 times more likely to also be gambling at risk, albeit the confidence interval is a bit wider around that. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the bottom right, where actually smokers are significantly less likely to be overweight or obese. Not my field at all, but I've been told that this is reliably seen in other data sets, could relate to metabolic pathways, possible appetite suppression, and satiety enhancement of nicotine. So, really hammering the point home, multiple risks are more prevalent and they cluster in the most deprived. So multiple risks is also a problem of the middle age. So people between 45 and 64, and I find my definition of middle age gets older as I do. And then the odds of 2 or more risks also, breaking things, increase with decreasing highest level of qualification, IMD quintile, and are then highest among the unemployed. And the relationships are always stronger for men than they are women. This is all English data, I should say. So, multiple risks are highly prevalent. 11.2 million adults have 2 or more of the risks that I've been talking about. Certain risks cluster. So, if you're drinking at risk levels, you're more likely to also smoke. There's also social disparity in the clustering of multiple risks, so this is an issue of deprivation. And we also now know that there are really important clinical consequences of these multiple risks. So these are these synergistic relationships that I've been speaking about that occur if you smoke and drink for head and neck cancers, and if you drink and are overweight for liver disease. So, if there are behavioral synergies and clinical synergies, what about policy synergies? So one of the things I want to think about is, are we working in silos a bit? So the WHO global strategies for the 3 leading risks that I've been talking about today all include actions on price, marketing, and availability, but they don't make any reference to joining these up. So in one part of the NCD strategy, it says you must reduce marketing of alcohol and you must protect children from its exposure. In another part of the strategy, you say you must reduce marketing from high-fat, salt, sugar foods and protect children from its exposure. Nowhere does it say in those strategies, you're trying to do the same policy here. You could maybe try and bring them together. So the next point I can attest to, having worked in a government health department for my sins for 10 years, they have separate teams and policy approaches. So there's usually an alcohol team, a tobacco team, an excess weight team. And they tend to collaborate better when they're thinking about treatment and health service response, but when we're thinking about the public health responses, taxation, marketing restrictions, none of them have conversations with each other, and they all embark on their own little missions, and actually we're often trying to achieve the same policies. Finance departments will make duty decisions on a case-by-case basis. So in the UK, the Chancellor every year has a look at the taxes. What shall I put up? What shall I put down? What shall I freeze? In other words, put down in real terms. And I wanted to put this data up because I think it's really striking just how differently tobacco taxes and alcohol taxes have been treated in the UK. So this is the monthly affordability of tobacco and alcohol. We have tobacco in blue, so you can see it gets steadily less affordable. I think it's, on last count, £20 for a packet of cigarettes, which is about 24 euros. Whereas alcohol just gets increasingly more affordable. And this is because tobacco has an annual duty escalator. So for many decades now, the tax on tobacco goes up in line with inflation, plus I think 2%. People in the room can correct me if I'm wrong. Whereas alcohol is used as a bit of a political bargaining tool. It's often given successive cuts and freezes, which is a cut in real terms. And the only point at which we actually see decreases in the monthly affordability of alcohol is between the periods of 2008 and 2013. And that's when the then Chancellor Alistair Darling implemented a alcohol duty escalator. So the price or the tax of alcohol went up in line with inflation, plus 2%, but it was repealed in 2013, and we just see that trend of alcohol being incredibly more affordable taking off. But I think it's just a really nice case study of just how differently these things have been treated. So many researchers, civil society organizations, charities, and medical academics, all of whom perform a vital advocacy role, also operate in these disease silos. But health risks cluster, they have clinical ramifications, and actually the evidence for the most effective and cost-effective policies is largely the same. So what are the most effective levers? This should be fairly familiar to everybody in this room, but we're talking about the 4 Ps: the price, promotion, the place, and the product. So you can increase a product price, e.g. With taxation or minimum prices. You can restrict marketing and advertising using things like watershed bans, or indeed just a complete ban, as they have in Thailand. You can limit when and where alcohol products can be sold and who can buy them, so things like the hours and days of sale, your density of outlets, and your minimum age restrictions. And then you can also regulate aspects of the product, so whether that's warning labels, nutritional and calorie information. So we're often aiming for the same policies here. So this is another piece of work published by my team this year in BMC Public Health, and it's an umbrella review of systematic reviews that aim to look at the relationship between the price and demand of alcohol, tobacco, unhealthy food, and sugar-sweetened beverages. We did also include gambling, but I should mention there were no review-level evidence. Now, this work didn't look at what happens to tobacco if you increase the price of alcohol, but what it does demonstrate is the universality of the pricing principle here. So this figure is the price elasticity of demand. So basically any estimate to the left-hand side of that line suggests that if price goes up, demand goes down. And what you can see is we've got alcohol, sugar-sweetened beverages, tobacco, unhealthy food, we should have called it something else, and then we have unhealthy food and sugar-sweetened beverages combined. And what we see is there is an inverse association consistently. So a 10% increase in product price was associated with a median reduction in demand of about 9% for sugar-sweetened beverages, 6% for unhealthy food, 5% for tobacco, and 1% for alcohol. I should point out, I hope no one authored them, but some of the sugar-sweetened beverage reviews are a bit rubbish. And actually, the alcohol estimates, the older estimates tend to place that more at 5%, and the more recent estimates pitch that a bit lower. But I think it's useful because it kind of shows that there's this universality of pricing. Now, there's a small body of literature that has looked at how taxing one commodity can affect the demand of another. So in the USA, there's evidence that increases in cigarette tax were associated with decreases in alcohol consumption among smokers. In the UK, the price elasticity for alcohol reduced from minus 0.56 to minus 0.26 when the price of food was included in the analysis. Now, this is really key, because it suggests that alcohol pricing policies can be undermined if retailers offset an increase in alcohol price either by decreasing the price of food or because consumers have more disposable income because food prices have gone down. Now, in the UK, we buy most of our alcohol in the off-trade from big supermarkets, and big supermarkets have more tools at their disposal to play with different pricing strategies, and of course, big supermarkets are themselves producers of alcohol. And then a final study in the UK, which is looking at price increases in medium sugar drinks, shown that that was associated with reductions in alcohol purchasing, but actually increases in the price of high sugar drinks were associated with an increase in purchasing of lager. So it's really important to kind of start looking beyond our own field and start thinking about how taxing one thing can affect another harm. Now, purely from a pragmatic perspective, there's also merit in thinking about these policy areas together. These are just random examples that I've picked, but I think that they are illustrative of the point I'm trying to make. So, for example, when marketing was banned, used to sponsor Formula One, it freed up a load of space for us then to advertise alcohol. This again, so on the left-hand side, you have Premier League shirts sponsored by alcohol companies, and on the right-hand side, you have Premier League shirts sponsored by gambling companies, and again, coincidental trends, but you can see that as Premier League sponsorship by alcohol companies decreases, we actually see concomitant increases in gambling company sponsorship. And then just a final example, if we do placement restrictions, so if you say high-fat, salt, sugar foods can no longer be shown at the end of aisles, it just frees up a load of space to put cheap booze there. And so just a final thought, there's also something to be said about riding the coattails or benefiting from somebody else's success. So I worked in alcohol policy for 10 years in England under a neoliberal government, and it's been very difficult to get decision makers to bite at public health measures for alcohol. But this is at the same time that they are very keen to do actions on tobacco control, and in recent years they've been much more likely to want to do things in the space of obesity. So in a sense, by combining the approaches, rather than coming in and saying, we need to restrict advertising of alcohol, you can come in and say, we need to restrict advertising of harm-causing commodities and protect children from them. And then you almost remove the toxicity of the word alcohol because you're actually talking about alcohol and gambling and high-fat, salt, sugar foods and all of those things together. And this is my beautiful campus in Scotland. Please do say hello if you're ever visiting. And yeah, thank you very much.
Robyn, thank you so much for that really clear presentation. This is a field where I kind of confess I thought I knew a fair amount, and I've been quite startled by some of your figures and just how important it is to understand synergies, and also how it makes you think of how that really matters right at the level of sort of high-level policy, even all the way down to how an individual person thinks about their chances of modifying their risks of getting seriously ill. So thank you so much. I'm going to be taking some questions for Robyn, and again, I'm going to try and adjust my eyes. So there's 2 microphones at the front here and 2 further back there. So if you want to make your way to the microphones, if you want to ask Robyn a question, don't be afraid. No question is too silly to ask. I can see some movement.
Hello.
Microphone 2, thank you.
This was brilliant, Robyn. Thank you so much. So, Senat Handanagic from EUDA. So just wondering, is your team interested in looking at also the synergies between illegal substances? For example, we see, for example, alcohol being really important part of drug-related deaths, whether that's benzodiazepines or opioids. So is there interest from you to look also at that data and see how those things could interact as well?
Fantastic question, fantastic idea. Absolutely, the methods could be very easily reproduced for illicit drug use. And if anyone in the room would like to fund me to do that, just let me know.
Okay, microphone 1, thank you.
Hey, I thought that was a great talk. Thanks so much. You mentioned towards the end in your umbrella review that there were no hits for gambling in the price elasticity. It's maybe not obvious how you go about testing the impact of the price of gambling. So can you elaborate a little bit on what kind of study design you think people might use to test that?
You've stumbled on such a difficult area. I've spent many hours trying to think how you would operationalize the price of gambling, and it gets really, really difficult, actually, when you start thinking if people win money? Does that count as minus the cost? I mean, there's going to be economists in the room who are probably much better at answering that question than I am, but really great thing that needs to be grappled with from a perspective of gambling and public health.
Thank you, Robyn. I think microphone 2. I think you.
Hi, thanks for an amazing talk. I'm Nikki Cole, come from London, and I'm a clinician and academic and in the position of trying to influence policymakers. And I have a reflection, which is that often when you talk to policymakers, they have their trade-offs that they're always making, and they'll say to you, well, we're doing this, so we can't do that. And it is this very silent approach. We're doing overweight, so we can't do alcohol. It sounds like you have extensive experience on the other side of that relationship. How would you advocate managing that response?
I mean, I haven't done a very good job of it, to be honest. We haven't got any of the sort of public health things implemented. I think you've just got to keep pushing the evidence, keep advocating, keep pointing out the evidence time and time again and wait for it to stick. Really, that's not a great answer, I'm afraid. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, go ahead. We've got another question at microphone 2.
Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Lydia. I work for the Health Department of the Government of Catalonia in Spain. It's been a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. We actually are working on integration of interventions, but especially on what it means intervention in primary health care, using early detection and brief interventions, integrated approach. And we are also working with a consortium, a large consortium in Europe in an European project, aiming to integrate the intervention in primary health care. Are you working in this direction too? I mean, how is the best approach to intervene when there is synergistic effects and co-occurrence in primary health care? And if you can give us or elaborate a little bit on that, because this is what we are now aiming to provide to professionals. We are trying to test the added value of doing synergistic intervention in primary health care, but it's not easy, the lack of time, etc. But if you can elaborate, it will be very helpful for us. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's excellent to hear. My experience in England is actually primary healthcare and local government tend to deal much better with multiple risks than actually when you're talking about public health policy. But yeah, really great to hear that you're developing that. My background is very much public health, which is kind of the lens in which I've focused this on, but you could definitely kind of take this in a direction of thinking about what does this mean for screening and brief intervention or other more tailored responses to people's kind of multiple risks, definitely.
Thank you. Robyn, you've got a question at microphone 1.
Oh. Thank you. Great talk. I was interested in kind of multiple timelines. So you included so many papers, so I don't know if it's easy to answer this, but for the people that have multiple risks, like for how long? And does that matter in your studies, kind of if someone is experiencing multiple risks for a short time, do you see differences?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So kind of like duration of exposure. It's something we haven't looked at. The review just got so huge, we had to keep it quite high level. But I mean, we have the data sat there to be able to look at something like that. And I think you're right, I'm not a kind of excess weight specialist by any means, but I guess that exposure is more prolonging, whereas someone's drinking can be quite rapidly changing in response to an intervention. So yeah, something for me to go away and think about. Feel free to email me and we can pick up a conversation.
Thanks. And then if I can have a follow-up question?
Go for it.
Thanks. It kind of the same area, but on the other side of it, how long would it take for preventive measures then to mitigate the risks, I guess? Do you have an idea on that?
So I am an alcohol person, so I can talk to that. And I'm also a public health person, so I will talk to that. But actually, we see quite rapid responses from pricing mechanisms. We've seen this in the experience of Canada and minimum unit price. We've seen it in Russia. There's many many countries that show actually you can have, and more recently Scotland, of course, you can have quite a rapid response. Some of that in terms of liver diseases, even though it takes many years for liver disease to develop, actually the biggest predictor of whether you're going to die is what you drank last week, because you get kind of acute on chronic liver failure. So actually, people think, oh, it takes ages to kind of prevent the liver disease, but actually it can respond very quickly to public health measures. You just need a bit of political will to implement them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, can I do one more?
I think we have got time for one more, and then actually we're going to come together, and then there will be a chance to ask more questions when we're all sitting together. But yes, go ahead.
Yes, sure. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I would like to follow up. I'm Lucas Wiesing, also from EUDA. I would like to follow up on the question of my colleague regarding illicit drugs. I was actually thinking, to what extent can you increase the price of legal substances until sort of illicit smuggling and counterfeit products start entering the market?
Yeah, so that's an argument we often hear from the alcohol industry, of course, in response to pricing. In Scotland, which is probably the best experience to talk to, there was a small-scale study that didn't show that there was large-scale, the price of alcohol didn't go up so much that people started using illicit substances. But then, of course, alcohol is incredibly affordable, and actually where the minimum unit price was set, it was sort of 10 years out of date by the time it was implemented. So, in theory, if there were prohibitively high prices, that's a possibility. I'm not aware of any empirical data, but I mean, there are much better experts in the room than me that will be. Thank you.
So, okay, now all three of us are together. So we're going to start talking, because I think Robyn and Marc have been listening to each other's presentations, which they probably hadn't heard before. I am going to be keeping an eye on the mics as well, or trying to. So if questions crop up while we're talking, please come towards the mics. I'm actually going to start, because Robyn has been talking about sort of complex interrelationships between risk factors. I think one of the things that's been rumbling away in my mind when I'm thinking about Marc's talk is you did mention co-occurrence of behavioral addictions and substance use disorders, but I'm kind of wondering what we learn about co-occurrence that helps us to think about classification for people who have both a behavioral addiction and a substance use disorder. I'll give you a little bit of this is my personal disclosure of shame. Is that for much of my clinical career, I would have put what we now call behavioral addictions in a very different box. And I was kind of quite happy with it there. I was working with people who had alcohol and drug problems. And I did look at the neuroscience and the pharmacology and thought I did. But it was actually an individual person telling me about his long history of struggles with gambling, eventually starting to drink heavily and getting help for the alcohol use because there were services for him. And I felt horrified at how many people I had missed over the course of my career who'd been drinking and had an underlying behavioral addiction that I didn't know about. So it's bothered me ever since. So, Marc, if you could tell us what we can learn about people who have histories or experiences like that and how it helps us.
Yes, so I think that this is an important area because, for example, we have probably the best data for gambling disorder. And if we look at the National Comorbidity Replication data, it's estimated that individuals with gambling disorder, 96% of them have one or more co-occurring psychiatric disorder, and close to 2/3 have 3 or more co-occurring disorders. So the co-occurrence is more the norm than the exception. And this is similar, for example, with substance use disorders and mental health concerns as well. And I think there have been movements for integrated care. There's the importance of physical health conditions with respect to substance use and mental health disorders. These are all, they may interact synergistically, and it's important to screen for and identify people with these concerns. It's estimated that around 1 in 10 individuals with gambling disorder ever enter into self-help or professional treatment for their disorder. So if people are recovering, a substantial proportion are going through natural recovery without formal intervention. But that raises the question about if we're allowing for that, to what extent are people's lives being damaged? Are, for youth, to what extent are optimal developmental trajectories being compromised by not identifying these concerns and getting appropriate help? And then how do we then best translate this information about what we know about the epidemiology into better public health policies, I think is particularly relevant for developing youth, particularly with respect to internet use behaviors. And I'm glad that the U.S. Surgeon General has identified social media use as a potential concern. It's estimated now that in the United States, 95% of high school students have their own smartphones, and about 46% are saying that they are online almost constantly. And this is about a doubling of the percentage from 10 years ago. And it's not just social media use. Another relatively untalked about concern among adolescents is pornography use and the extent to which developing youth are having their sexual arousal templates or receiving their sex education from pornography. And then what are their expectations going into dyadic relationships, or there are reports of young adult men experiencing erectile dysfunction that they attribute to excessive pornography consumption as adolescents. So there are a number of concerns that we need to understand better and then need to intervene in a more helpful way.
Thank you, Marc. I'm also going to come to Robyn because you've listened to Marc's presentation as well, and I know gambling isn't your main field, but you have worked in policy settings for quite a long time, and I think during that time you'll have seen your colleagues sort of having to really try and think about behavioural addictions as a public health problem, and I don't think it came that naturally from looking from the outside, and I wondered if you had any observations about how you were seeing that process in the settings you worked in.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think you're right. In England, it came a bit the other direction, where there was suddenly political interest in gambling, and then the public health teams had to go, well, we need to frame this as a public health response. How do we best do it? But I think there are still some challenges. We had a great question about how do you operationalize the price of gambling. So, I think that is going to be something we have to tackle head on when we're thinking about public health and gambling. I think the area of kind of marketing restrictions and availability is kind of fits right into the family of kind of the alcohol and tobacco regulation, so it's much easier to think about it in that way. But then the other thing I would say is the idea that small amounts of gambling can cause harm in large numbers of people isn't actually very well empirically backed in England, for fear of upsetting many gambling specialists in the room. So I would say that there's probably huge potential as researchers to go away and try and get better data to kind of demonstrate that distribution, yeah.
So I think this is an area of one of those intersections where it's rapidly changing, at least in the United States. So in the United States, online sports betting has been increasingly legalized state by state. So now in 39 states, there's legalized sports gambling, and in the majority of those, there's legalized online sports gambling. And in the setting of this, there's also been a rapid increase in the amount of advertising, such that the main gambling entities are advertising over $300 million a year on television ads. And in this setting, after, for example, in Connecticut, when online sports gambling was legalized, we saw a 90% increase in callers to our gambling helpline. And this is largely coming from or about young adult males with online sports gambling problems, with about 2/3 of the callers coming from the individual himself and about 1/3 from a concerned parent, usually the mother. So these are things that we do need to collect the data and be mindful that this is an evolving or rapidly changing space.
Thank you. I think we've got 6 minutes and 2 questions. So the first one to microphone 1. Thank you for waiting patiently.
Thanks a lot for beautiful presentations. I'm from Norway. In Norway and Sweden, we have advertising for alcohol and for smoking is not allowed. Also, there are strict regulations for the gambling. Anyway, we drink in Norway. We smoke, and we gamble, but maybe 10%, 20% less. And the sickness, the illness burden is a little lower. Look to Norway, I say. Well, it helps having these regulations, but they are under pressure. And they are unpopular. So the political parties in Norway, they know that if we do increase our regulations, it will help for the public health, but then we will lose our voters. So that's our problems. Thanks.
Thank you for that observation. I don't know if everyone heard that. I think our speaker was talking about policies and controls in Norway, which are actually quite effective, but also the fact that they continue to be challenged. Is that not right? So you can't sit still. You still have to keep looking. And so we have one last question at microphone 2. Thank you.
A question for Marc. I don't know as much about the ABCD study as I'd like to, but you pointed out a predictor, early identification of a difference in a brain. I think it was connectivity, I can't remember exactly. I know that this will only account for a limited amount of the variance in adult addiction, whether it's alcohol or gambling, because there are many other environmental factors, childhood influences, which are going to influence how much of the variance can be explained by that pre-morbid abnormality. My question is there evidence in recovered addicts that that pre-morbid abnormality that you mentioned can be changed by treatment or by the passage of time, life experience, etc.?
Yes, so great question. With this brain structural covariation pattern, which may reflect coordinated development of specific brain regions, that's how we've hypothesized this to operate. We don't have sufficient data. However, for example, I presented some of the monetary incentive delay task data. There we have data from adolescent smokers, for example, who were undergoing treatment, smoking cessation treatment. And that blunting of reward-related brain region activations during the anticipatory phase of reward processing, we found that after treatment, we saw increases in the brain responses during the task performance, suggesting that there is this malleability and change that is possible with respect to some of the hypothesized brain circuits that we think are involved in addictive processes. I think we've heard also about psychedelics within the these lectures, and the potential for inducing synaptic plasticity is an area that is one that we have been investigating, as we have a PET imaging ligand to assess synaptic density in living human beings, and we see that people with different substance use disorders show regional specific decreased synaptic density in a regional fashion. So these are areas where we think we can gather more data to understand the dynamic brain processes linked to recovery. Because the brain is plastic. We remember things. The brain has adapted to change to environmental stimuli. We just need to understand better the specifics of that process and how that links to recovery from addictions.
Thank you.
So that was a great question to end on, and thank you so much. I think we've kept to time. So I'm going to thank both speakers and all of you, great big audience on the last day, for making this session so lively and so enjoyable.
Thank you for great moderation.